Today we are unpacking a story that has quietly sent shockwaves through global politics, a story that challenges assumptions many people have held for years about the relationship between China and Russia.
Progress awaits. Let us proceed.
The idea that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin stand shoulder to shoulder against the West has been repeated so often that it feels like an unbreakable truth. But recent signals suggest something far more complicated, and possibly far more dangerous for Moscow. On the surface, China and Russia present themselves as strategic partners. They talk about a shared vision of a multipolar world, resistance to Western dominance, and deepening economic and military cooperation. Their leaders appear together at summits, exchange warm words, and coordinate positions in international forums. But behind this public display, the balance of power between the two has been shifting rapidly. China today is an economic superpower with global supply chains, massive industrial capacity, and growing technological influence. Russia, meanwhile, is increasingly isolated, heavily sanctioned, and economically strained. This imbalance matters because partnerships between unequal powers rarely remain equal for long. Over time, the stronger side gains leverage, and the weaker side becomes dependent. Since the start of Russia's war in Ukraine, that imbalance has only grown. Western sanctions have cut Russia off from key markets, technologies, and financial systems. In response, Moscow has turned east, relying more and more on Beijing for trade, investment, and diplomatic cover. Energy exports that once flowed to Europe are now being redirected to China, often at discounted prices. From China's perspective, this has created a golden opportunity. Beijing can secure cheap energy, expand its influence over Russian infrastructure, and position itself as Moscow's most important economic lifeline. But dependence cuts both ways, and the more Russia relies on China, the more vulnerable it becomes to Chinese pressure. This is where the idea of betrayal begins to take shape. While China has publicly avoided condemning Russia, it has also avoided fully supporting Moscow's war effort. Beijing has been careful not to cross Western red lines that could trigger secondary sanctions. Chinese companies have limited certain exports, banks have reduced exposure, and official rhetoric has remained deliberately vague. At the same time, China has positioned itself as a potential mediator, calling for peace talks and political solutions. On the surface, this sounds constructive. But in reality, it allows Beijing to appear responsible while quietly benefiting from Russia's weakened position. Mediation gives China influence without committing to Russia's goals. For Moscow, this can feel like a knife in the back. Russia expected more than neutrality. It expected loyalty from a partner that has repeatedly emphasized strategic alignment. Instead, it is finding that China's priorities come first, and Russia's interests are secondary at best. The economic dimension of this relationship reveals even more. China is not treating Russia as an equal trading partner. It is negotiating hard, driving down prices, and demanding favorable terms. Russian energy is being sold at discounts that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Chinese firms are stepping in where Western companies left, but they are doing so on their own terms. This dynamic is not accidental. China has a long history of leveraging economic power for strategic gain. By binding Russia closer through trade and infrastructure, Beijing increases its influence over Russian decision-making. Over time, this can translate into political leverage that reshapes the relationship entirely. There is also a strategic angle that deeply worries Russian elites. China's long-term ambitions do not necessarily align with Russia's. Beijing's focus is on Asia, global trade routes, and technological dominance. Russia's interests, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, sometimes overlap with China's plans, but they can also clash. Central Asia is a prime example. Historically, this region has been part of Russia's sphere of influence. But China's economic footprint there has grown dramatically through investment, infrastructure projects, and trade. While Russia has been distracted and weakened by war and sanctions, China has quietly expanded its presence, filling gaps that Moscow can no longer manage. This shift has not gone unnoticed in Moscow. Russian analysts and policymakers understand that influence lost is rarely regained. As China deepens its role in Central Asia, Russia risks becoming a junior partner even in regions it once dominated. That is not partnership. That is displacement. Military cooperation between China and Russia is another area filled with contradictions. Joint exercises and statements suggest unity, but there are limits to how far China is willing to go. Beijing is learning from Russia's mistakes in Ukraine, studying modern warfare, sanctions resilience, and information campaigns, all without fully committing itself. In this sense, Russia is becoming a test case for China. Beijing can observe how the West responds to aggression, how sanctions bite over time, and how global opinion shifts. These lessons are invaluable, especially when China considers its own future challenges. But learning from Russia's suffering is not the same as standing with Russia in solidarity. There is also the issue of technology and intellectual property. For years, Russia believed it could cooperate with China on advanced military and civilian technologies. But China has increasingly developed its own capabilities and no longer needs Russia as much as it once did. In some areas, China is now the supplier and Russia the customer. This reversal is deeply uncomfortable for a country that once saw itself as a great power on par with China. Dependence on Chinese technology and components erodes Russia's strategic autonomy. It also gives Beijing another lever to pull if relations ever sour. Diplomatically, China's actions speak louder than its words. While Beijing often echoes Russian talking points about NATO expansion or Western hypocrisy, it stops short of endorsing Russia's most aggressive claims. China maintains relationships with Ukraine, Europe, and the United States, carefully balancing its interests across multiple fronts. This balancing act allows China to keep its options open. If Russia weakens further, China can distance itself without paying a high price. If Russia somehow stabilizes, China still benefits from a compliant partner desperate for support. Either way, Beijing wins flexibility, and Moscow bears the risk. From a Russian perspective, this is starting to look less like friendship and more like exploitation. The rhetoric of shared values masks a reality where China extracts maximum benefit while offering minimal commitment. That is a hard truth for Russian leaders who believe they were building a durable alliance. The phrase backstabbing captures this emotional dimension. It reflects a sense of betrayal, not necessarily because China is openly hostile, but because it is quietly self-serving at Russia's expense. In geopolitics, silence and hesitation can be as damaging as open opposition. Some analysts argue that China's ultimate goal is to see Russia weakened but not collapsed. A weakened Russia is easier to influence, easier to bargain with, and less capable of challenging China's ambitions. At the same time, Russia's continued existence as a large, resource-rich state helps distract the West and complicate global power dynamics. This cynical calculus fits China's long-term strategic thinking. Beijing plans decades ahead. It values stability, predictability, and advantage. Emotional loyalty to partners ranks far below national interest. In that framework, Russia is a tool, not a brother in arms. The implications of this dynamic extend far beyond Moscow and Beijing. Western policymakers are watching closely, trying to understand whether cracks in the China-Russia relationship can be widened. At the same time, they are cautious not to push the two closer together through miscalculation. For countries caught in between, especially in Asia and Eurasia, this shifting relationship creates uncertainty. They must navigate a world where alliances are fluid and great powers pursue interests with little regard for sentiment or history. The narrative of a solid China-Russia axis has always been an oversimplification. What we are seeing now is the reality beneath that narrative. Power, not friendship, defines international relations. When power shifts, relationships change. Russia's leadership may still publicly praise China, but privately, concerns are growing. Being dependent on a single powerful partner is dangerous. It limits options and reduces bargaining power. Over time, it can reshape a country's foreign and domestic policies in ways that are hard to reverse. China, for its part, will continue to play a careful game. It will deny any betrayal, emphasize cooperation, and speak of mutual respect. But its actions will continue to prioritize Chinese interests above all else. That is not sinister in a moral sense, but it is ruthless in a strategic one. The real question is how Russia responds. Does it accept its junior status and try to make the best of it, or does it seek ways to rebalance, rebuild ties elsewhere, and regain autonomy? That choice will shape Russia's future for years to come. This unfolding story reminds us that global politics is rarely about good versus evil or loyalty versus betrayal. It is about power, leverage, and survival. Leaders may speak of friendship, but states act on interests. As this situation evolves, we may see more subtle signs of tension, more quiet disagreements, and more evidence that the partnership is not as solid as it appears. Whether this leads to an open rift or remains a silent, uneasy alignment remains to be seen. What is clear is that the myth of unconditional China-Russia unity is fading. In its place, we see a relationship defined by imbalance, calculation, and quiet maneuvering. For Russia, that realization may come too late. For China, it is simply another step in a long-term strategy to shape the world on its own terms. We will continue to follow this story closely, because what happens between Beijing and Moscow will influence global power dynamics, security calculations, and the future of international relations. Stay with us as we break down every development and uncover what lies beneath the headlines. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel.